already a quite
Do you also
decent number of participants. Sorry.
Are you also planning to put it online or just record it for the students?
So it will probably go on the on our website, the website of the Melton Center for Jewish Studies. I will also distribute it for students who are unable to join us today. And then I don't know, we can think maybe of other things to do with it. But I think for now it's mostly for students. Maybe people who registered and could not show up, could not attend, and for our website.
Quite a nice turnout.
Amos, we can't hear you.
Yeah, I couldn't hear you.
I say now it's better.
Yeah.
Saying that it's quite a nice turnout in discipline.
Yeah, right. Hi, Tamar.
Hi. I've been here, but it took me a while to figure out how to appear on the screen. I wasn't sure. I had to ask Lori. She had to bring me on, I guess. I wanted to welcome both of you, Amos and Bashir. I'm really excited about this program. Should we wait another minute or should we get started? I mean, we've got almost 150 people, so I think we should probably get started.
I think we can start, yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, this is the official start of the program. My name is Tamar Radovsky, and I'm the director of the Melton Center at The Ohio State University. And we are really thrilled to be supporting this program with the generosity and support of Tom and Diann Mann, who have really contributed greatly to our Jewish Studies program at Ohio State. I don't know, Tom, if you're here or not today. I haven't looked at the list of participants, but if you are, a shout out, thank you. Tom and Diann have actually supported 2 series. They've been ongoing for 15 years or more. This year's series is really devoted to issues of diversity and marginality. And so the Mann Symposium series actually kicks off next week with Professor Jessica Margolin speaking about Sephardi Jews. She's going to be focusing in particular on Tunisia. And this series, which is orchestrated or not organized by Ori, our professor, our Israel Studies Schottenstein professor at Ohio State, is focusing on issues of race and ethnicity in Israel. And we took Tom at his word. He really established this series so that we could initiate conversations between Israeli, Jewish, Palestinian voices. And so we took that very seriously, and we're very excited to offer this program. I'm going to turn over now to Ori.
Thank you very much, Tamar. I want to thank, first of all, everyone for joining us today. I also want to thank my colleagues at the Melton Center for Jewish Studies here at Ohio State for their help in organizing the program. I will introduce our speakers in a moment, but first let me explain how the session will work. We will not have formal lectures, but more of a conversation. I will start by asking the speakers several questions, and then we will turn to questions from you, the people attending the program. So I invite all of you to print your questions in the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen, not the chat box, not the chat, but the Q&A. This will be easier and more efficient to handle. So please print your questions in the Q&A feature. You can write your questions at any time during the discussion, but I will turn to them a little bit later. So now let me turn to introduce our speakers who are joining us from Jerusalem, I believe, both of them. So for them, it's already evening. First, we have Bashir, who is an associate professor of political theory at the Open University of Israel and a senior research fellow at the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute. He's co-editor of the Politics of Reconciliation in Multicultural Societies, and more recently, of the Arab and Jewish Christians, which came out last year. And we also have Amos Goldberg, who is an associate professor in the Department of Jewish History and Contemporary Jewry at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. His books include Trauma in First Person, Diary Writing During the Holocaust, which came out 3 years ago, and his forthcoming book in Hebrew, 5 Critical Readings in Holocaust Memory, will be published in 2022. The book that our speakers co-edited, titled The Holocaust and the Nakba, A New Grammar of Trauma and History, which is the subject of our discussion of today, of course, was originally published in Hebrew in 2015, and a different version came out in English. We just discussed the changes from the Hebrew and English version. So the English version was published in 2018 with the Columbia University Press. The book, which features essays by leading Jewish and Arab intellectuals, discusses a sensitive but a very important topic, and has already generated a lively debate. And I hope that our discussion today will contribute to this ongoing debate and will help to shed more light on the issues arising from the book. So with that, I want to start by asking the both of you to please share with us a brief description of your project, brief description of the book, and to talk a little bit about what led you to write a book on this topic. Whoever wants to go first. Bashir, do you want to start?
We have the rule that Amos always starts.
Seniority. I'm
Okay.
older. I think what we try to do is to try to framework for discussing those two foundational traumatic memories of the two people together. How can we talk about those two events together in a meaningful, insightful way? We can talk later why we should do this and why various aspects. I think today I think it's essential, and I think there's no other way to tell the stories. They are so connected and interrelated on every register that we can think of. We can talk about it. But the idea is to really structure a framework, conceptual, historical, even cultural, that would be meaningful to put those two traumatic, as I say, foundational paths together. Foundational paths, we use here Alon Confino's term. Those are two memories and two stories and two histories that form the identity of the two people. And so this is what, and it's a very difficult project because they are usually not only told to separately, but they are told as exclusionary narrative. That if you talk about the Holocaust, you can't talk about the Nakba, and if you talk about the Nakba, you can't talk about the Holocaust because each one it sort of excludes the other. Who is the real victim and who is the real perpetrator? So this is the big challenge. And after, even if you have good faith and you do want to put them together in our culture, it's very difficult because there are two very, very different stories. One is, I would say, on every scale you look at it, they are different, though, as I say, interconnected. So on the one hand, we can say that the Holocaust is radical, perhaps some say unique. I don't agree to that, but unprecedented. But it's a very radical genocide. On the other hand, the Nakba, we would define it as an ethnic cleansing. So ethnic cleansing and genocide are not the same in scale, in magnitude, on that. But the other hand, the Palestinians are not involved in the Holocaust. the Jews, the Zionist Jews are very much involved in the Nakba. So how do you, the issue of guilt and responsibility is completely different on both sides. So how do you intersect them? And nonetheless, we think they should be put together. And I'll just briefly, we will probably unpack it later, but I would say, first of all, because they belong to the same era, they are just three years apart. And it's certainly I come from Jewish history, certainly they just one after the other. The Holocaust ended in May 1945. The war ended, and the Jews continued their history and in various venues and in various avenues. One of them, a major one, was here in Eretz Israel, Palestine, where the Jewish, the state of Israel was established, and the Nakba was also happened. This ethnic cleansing. Those are two. So the connections between the 1945 and 1948 is very obvious for all those who speak about the state of Israel, but something else happened. In a different register, we can say that whenever on a much, more, I would say, dialogical register, whenever you talk about the Nakba with Palestinians, with Jews, they want to talk about the Holocaust. And whenever you talk about the Holocaust, you talk the other side wants to talk about the Palestinians want to talk about Nakba. So if you think history is important for our identity and for our shared identity, shared fate and history, and our shared future, we have to talk about history. So we have to find a way to talk about them together, because if you want to talk about history, you can't talk about one without the other. That's just a matter of fact. Almost say. We can talk about other registers afterwards, but we believe those have to be. They have to be. We have to find a way to talk about them together in a meaningful way, not just meaningful way, historically, conceptually, politically, morally, and while being very much aware of the huge differences on every register that we think of between them. So that's basically our project. And it's an edited book, so we set the framework, but we didn't write all the chapters as wrote a big introduction. But it's a collective Jewish Palestinian project.
Thank you, Amos, for those opening remarks. Bashir, could you also share with us your thoughts?
Yeah, very briefly, just not to repeat what Amos said, I would like to evoke like 3-4 points very quickly about the value of this project and what motivated me partly to come into this. So first of all, in academic terms, this enterprise that has been ongoing anyway, I mean, Amos and I have written several joint pieces. This is not the last one that you have in hand, the book. And that is really to fill a gap in the literature that I think, the unique perspective we bring from our domains, he being in history, me being in political theory, I think our joint efforts, even conceptually and disciplinary-wise, contributes to filling a very remarkable gap through where the Holocaust and the Nakba, haven't been discussed jointly, and what is the value from that, if you want to say, vis-a-vis certain disciplines and accounts. This is the first point. The second point, which is related to that, is that Amos and I contextualize our project within a larger strand and a kind of a context of scholarship. And that scholarship is basically when it brings this shift from the imperial order to the national order, and the desire of the nation modern state for homogeneity and purity. And therefore, seeing these types of events and traumas for all their differences and specificities, how they are interlinked also in that conceptual historical context of different levels of ethnic cleansing, exchange of population, genocides, and different types of things. The third point that I want to mention, nevertheless, is really that others have done that attempt of bringing the Holocaust and the Nakba in tandem, but they never have done in the sense of developing a full developed account and a framework. And in that sense, from the Jewish side, from the Arab Palestinian side, Avot Yeshurun, Yizhar, on the Palestinian side, Saeed, Ghassan Kanafani, and many others have invoked these kind of conversation between the Holocaust and the Nakba, but they never went really further making the account. And And the last thing that I want to say is actually, and by this I finish, I mean, what really motivated me to do that is basically also that I discovered, as Amos and I start talking about this, an unbelievable transformative friendship and relationship and partnership with Amos, through which I learned a great deal, through which I also pushed the limits of my intellectual horizons and all of that stuff. And in that sense, this project for me, in a way or another, and by this I finish, is really what we say in the secondary title, on the subtitle of the book, which is a new grammar. And I think for Israel-Palestine, we are desperately in need now for a new conversation, for a new paradigm, for vocabularies that can enable and allow us to navigate our way through the deadlock and the crisis we are finding ourselves, because the terminologies, vocabularies, concepts, and terms that have been the way through which we put the lens to understand Israel-Palestine, many of them, or at least some of them, either losing explanatory interpretive power or are becoming entirely irrelevant to describe the changing and transformative colonial realities on the ground. And therefore, this book is a decent contribution through where I motivated, by that kind of, impulse to contribute. And I think Amos and I, this is, where our friendship intellectually, personally, and our concerns about the future of this land and its people are putting these efforts to move forward in that direction.
Thank you, Bashir. So there is also an interesting personal dimension to this project, which seems to be important for the both of you. And both of you in your comments mentioned both the historical connections, the historical, but also connections in terms of narrative and memory and identity. And we'll return, I think, to most of those questions later. But I want to begin with the question about narratives. So you show in the book that the role of the Nakba and the Holocaust in Palestinian and Israeli collective identities is guided by two mainstream narratives. The Palestinian narrative first describes the Nakba, the catastrophe of the Palestinians in 1948, and the creation of Israel in the same year as an example of the crimes of European colonialism. Of course, seeing Zionism as a colonialist movement, the dispossession of the Palestinians in 1948, which actually also began earlier. In this narrative, the dispossession resulted from an alliance between Zionism and the Western world, which was also expressed in the UN decision to partition Palestine into Jewish and Arab states. So this is the part of the Palestinian mainstream narrative, and then the Jewish Zionist narrative that views the creation of Israel as the inevitable and rightful outcome of the Nazi genocide, as part of the Western world's obligation to make amends for the Second World War and the Holocaust. So those are two diametrically opposed narratives about what happened in 1948. So my question is, how does your book try to mitigate or challenge the dichotomy between those two mainstream narratives?
You want to go first, or I will go? Okay. So you know what? I will. We mentioned Avot Yeshurun. I think, as you say, or perhaps to be very brief, as the way you put those narratives are very exclusionary, because according, and actually they belong, as Bashir has already actually hinted, to what we perceive as, Bashir and I perceive as, and not only us, as two big narratives that dominate, and we follow here Charles Meyer from Harvard, the great historian from Harvard University, and others that really distinguish between two major narratives that not only in Israel-Palestine, but to somehow that developed towards the end of the 20th century, and many people around the world see each of them or both of them as a telling narrative, explanatory narrative to explain modernity. And one is really the Holocaust narrative, and the other one is the colonial and anti-colonial and post-colonial narrative. They sometimes clash, and sometimes they have all kinds of relationship between them. But here in Israel, and I say here because we are both in Jerusalem, Israel, Palestine, here they clash very, I would say, with a lot of bloodshed because, as you said, the Jews who came here to Eretz Israel, Palestine, felt themselves as, many of them felt themselves as refugees and saw themselves, for good reasons, as refugees, and that the new political system, I would say, modern political system, because not in Europe, could not, they don't have a place in it, and the Holocaust was a culmination of those processes, and they deserve a place and self-determination, and they found it here. And those who, and the Palestinians who were the indigenous people, are just interfering in this, just doing just because to those ultimate victims. And the Nakba is precisely the opposite, because the indigenous people say that they don't have to pay the price of those of European history here in the Middle East, and they are the invaders, and we the Jews are invaders. Now, so what we think is, first of all, we do accept that this is the basis that Zionism is a settler colonial, not only, it could not be, it does not exhaust Zionism, but is a settler colonial movement that had done wrong to the Palestinians. This is something that we have to acknowledge as the baseline. And at the same time, the Jews who came here, many of them after the Holocaust in the 30s or even before, harsh anti-Semitism. So those are the basic facts that I mean, it's much more complex, but those are the basic facts that you have to acknowledge in order to put those two narratives. Now, I want to jump to give you an example how someone who I think both of us, Bashir and I, admire, an Israeli poet that we mentioned already, Avot Yeshurun, who came in the 20s from as a Zionist pioneer to, and we would say also as a settler colonialist to Palestine, Israel. He cut all his relations with his family because he perceived himself as a new man, as a Jew in Palestine. And then came the Holocaust, and all his he came from Eastern Europe, and all his family perished. And that, and then he also participated in 1948 war. And those two traumas, he lived those two traumas existentially, not only politically, existentially. And he actually invented a new poetic grammar of trauma that mingles Hebrew, broken Hebrew with Yiddish and a lot of Arabic, broken Arabic. And he already in 1952 wrote a poem, which he called Passover over Caves. And in a very sophisticated language, he mentioned both the Holocaust and the Nakba, and he was greatly attacked for that in those first years of the state by mainstream Zionist cultural and political forces, and he was also, I mean, not completely, but. And then in 1958, he wrote another book, another poem to explain. And he wrote this 1958, he wrote this a poem which is called Hanmaka, reasoning. And I will read it first in Hebrew, the last lines, and then in English, because he says about the Holocaust, he explains why he connects the Holocaust. And then he says, and he ends this poem, he says, שואת יהודי אירופה ושואת ערביי ארץ ישראל, שואה אחת של העם היהודי, ישר בפנים מביטות השתיים, אלה אדבר. And I will now translate it to English. He says, like, the Holocaust and the Holocaust of European Jews and the Holocaust of the Palestinian Arabs are one Holocaust of the Jewish people. They both stare right in the face, and he calls them Shoat Arvei Eretz Israel. He takes responsibility also for what him as a Zionist did it's his own trauma, it's his own history. So I think when you feel that we Jews experienced the Holocaust, and then we experienced as perpetrators, as wrongdoers, also, and it's part of our history, the Nakba, then just 3 years afterwards, then you can start morally and historically connect the two narratives. But this is the basic, taking responsibility and understanding that like many other nations who have less positive aspects of their history, we have in our history the Nakba, the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians. We have to come to terms with it in the flow of history that just 3 years before the Holocaust happened. So I think this is the framework that I'm suggesting, for, at least from a Jewish perspective. Bashir has, he would talk about his perspective.
Well, can I, Ori, very briefly? Yeah.
Sure, yeah, take your time.
I mean, my perspective on this, you ask how does our book really mitigate or challenge this dichotomous binary kind of account? And one way to look at this project, at least the way I see it, is that our attempt is to go beyond segregation, partition, and separation as a conceptual thing, not a conceptual political thing, not only, and in that sense, the language that has dominated, Israel-Palestine for a very long time, for a few decades, has been the language of partition, segregation, separation, drawing boundaries. And for different reasons, some of it has to do with the history, as we indicate. Other has to do with the very specific colonial reality. The Arabs and the Jews have become inseparable. They are way much more interconnected and intertwined than any time before in the history of the conflict, in different ways and in different magnitudes and in the very graphic sense of it. And in that sense, actually, the very aggressive Israeli colonial policies that they display, whether these 3 different techniques of control, surveillance, checkpoints, walls, fences, different techniques, actually the ultimate proof why the Arabs and the Jews have become inseparable. So this kind of book and the attempt and the frame Amos and I propose is actually taking that inseparability very seriously and very profoundly. And also because the Palestinian has been residing and has turned into a permanent resident in the Israeli Jew, and the opposite is true. And in that sense, I think there is a very powerful claim to make metaphorically and empirically about the fact that this land, with all of its history, is inseparable and not easy to divide. And therefore, this is, if you wish, in very different terms, or in different terms, not very, but different terms, is basically rethinking the question of Israel-Palestine differently through different lenses. Our contribution here is to say that we can see Israel-Palestine differently with all the sensitivities. And if you read our joint work, you will see that the nuances and the different things. But our book is a call, is an invitation, is a very decent and modest invitation for looking at the reality, not escaping the reality, but engaging with the reality differently, with engaging with the history differently and envisioning the future differently. That is differently meaning through Arab-Jewish partnership, through intertwinement, through dismantling hegemony, domination, and colonial relations. This is the intertwining that we see. This is the interconnectedness that we see. This is the premise that we see as the platform for what we call Arab-Jewish partnership, or what we, in much more academic terms, we call it egalitarian binationalism. So the interconnectedness is this inseparability that calls for a different type of engagement, different readings of the realities. And in that way is actually a different call of historical reference. Not that, as Oslo was suggesting, that we start in 1967. Our call here is to go back to the Nakba and even before that, to understand the wider historical context, to make sense of these kind of intertwining tragic memories, and that continue to inform our realities. And in that sense, the Nakba is also different in a way than the Holocaust is, that actually, and this is that the Nakba is ongoing. The Nakba is not a historical past. The Palestinian, every single Palestinian on the planet today continues to suffer, continues to feel, continues on a daily basis, not like every second, but is impacted directly by the consequences of the Nakba, because the Nakba did not stop in 48. It continues until today in different magnitudes, forms, and techniques.
Can I say one more thing? That
Yeah.
I think when we suggest, when we say those narratives and reflection of the reality, we say actually, I think we say two things, that we suggest here to tell them together, and we suggest that the readers cannot take it all the way. They don't have to agree with all our assumptions. I think even if they can go halfway with us and disagree with us on the other halfway, they can think that they should be together, they should be put together, but they won't go all the way in understanding it, agreeing with us theoretically and morally or ethically and politically. But the fact is that the stories are so much connected, I think could not be disputed. I mean, it's very hard they are so near, and the people who experience them many of them experience them either as Avot Yeshurun, who, by the way, in 1992 got the Israel Prize, the highest prize that the States gives to people of culture and academia. So he's not a marginal poet. So he experienced both, and there are many, I think even my generation, in the memory experience both. So I think they are inseparable. Now, we suggest that if they are inseparable, let's not deny their connectedness and find a way to tell them together. Now, we suggest, of course, we see it in a larger framework, but even if someone does not want to adopt the whole, our entire framework, theoretically, politically, historically, I think he or she cannot avoid confronting the interconnectedness, and they should suggest how to put them together.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's difficult to avoid the connections, as I tell my students often. Holocaust survivors fought in the 1948 war. So this is one very, very tangible connection, that Jewish survivors of the Nazi genocide immigrated to Israel and then became soldiers in the war of 1948. Another connection, very tangible connection, is in the fact that some of the Jewish survivors, settled in houses that had been inhabited previously by Palestinian Arabs who had become refugees in 1948. So if you look at the historical connections, I mean, it's very hard to avoid discussion about those historical connections. But now I want to take a step back and look at the question of memory for the benefits of participants and students who are not very familiar with the role of the memory of the Holocaust in Jewish-Israeli experience, and memory of the Nakba in the Palestinian experience. So I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about that. And you show in the book that the Holocaust became a central component of Jewish identity actually only in the 1970s and 1980s, and that the Nakba became a crucial part of Palestinian identity right after 1948, since 1948. So can you talk a little bit about these processes? Why do you think it took the Holocaust more time to acquire this status in Jewish-Israeli collective identity? Why the Nakba was incorporated or integrated faster into Palestinian identity, and maybe also reflect more generally about how those tragedies became crucial parts of Palestinian and Jewish-Israeli identities. Again, for the benefit of those who are not really familiar with those historical experiences. Bashir, maybe you want to go first now?
Sure. I mean, very briefly in relation to the Nakba, and I have something to say about the Holocaust, but maybe I give it to Amos because he's also mainly a historian of the Holocaust, among other kind of things. But in terms of the Nakba, I mean, the Nakba, I mean, as I said, I mean, the Nakba is ongoing. This is first. The Nakba was very intimately tied to the lives and the existence of Palestinians, also in the way, you know, on the way of their revival, in their national identity revival, in the sense of like, you know, Palestinians have become within a short period of time the biggest community of refugees registered in the world. They continue to be until today in terms of at least the UNRWA kind of files. You know, probably the Syrians have passed by, you know, unfortunately, the numbers of Palestinian refugees, but as a registered thing. And one of the most important things is to understand that actually, you know, that kind of elimination and negation and denial has been so unbelievably constitutive of the Palestinian identity, meaning that not recognizing Palestine and the Palestinians as a national identity, something that the British started and continued with the Zionists, and for a very long decades after the Nakba, has been that driving force of Palestinian nationalism vis-a-vis these types of negations. And therefore, the Nakba and its ongoing consequences, the lived, you know, the consequences and the politicization of it has been an extremely instrumental thing, let alone that the Nakba also has this Arab dimension to it, meaning that it has also been nested in the Arab conscious and in the Arab makeup of societies, definitely in neighboring countries. So its presence, its relevance, its, you know, its primary is obviously and you know, has been always continuing and has also a very serious political role to play. And therefore, from very early on, also Pan-Arabism as the ideology that dominated early stages of Palestinian nationalism after the Nakba made, at least rhetorically, the Nakba as a very central thing in its own politizations of terms of like regional politics. That is Nasserism with Jamal Abdel Nasser and Egypt, and then, you know, the PLO and many other things. I don't want to go into much history and details, just to show also that there is a dimension that made this kind of a very serious central, through which also there was a very serious reflection on that kind of, if you wish, defeat and the Palestinian Nakba. And, you know, the origins of the term is really very fascinating. There's a very interesting Palestinian, you know, researcher originally from a Syrian refugee camp, Anahid, who wrote a book about how the Palestinian refugees in Syria have conceptualized this with, you know, with the, you know, the way Arabs have been talking about the Nakba. So, but I mean, to cut a very long story short, but also we need to be very careful how to see the centrality of the Nakba in political mainstream discourse and formal discourse, because I would argue that in the late 70s, with the PLO coming to terms with partition, the Nakba as such a powerful organizing line of the political discourse of Palestine is starting to decline, given the fact that the PLO is starting to take seriously the issue of the two-state solution. Now, what Amos and I do in the book, and by this I finish, is that actually the Nakba, in at least political terms, is making a return in the sense of the imminent centrality of it as one of the most foundational, if not the most foundational lens to look at Palestinian question, thanks to the fact that Israel, through its colonial policies, is making the two-state solution impossible, with many other complicated reasons why that is not happening. And the Israeli legislation of Israel as being the nation state of the Jewish people and granting national self-determination exclusively to the Jews is actually a very serious attempt to liquidate the Nakba through two things. One is to liquidate the right of return, which is, again, Israel contributing heavily to bringing the question of Palestine back to its origins, rather than what Oslo attempt to do. And that also in relation to the Palestinian citizens of Israel, who Israel, through that law, subjugated them constitutionally to third-class citizen through, you know, constitutionalized Jewish supremacy and Jewish privilege. So in that sense, the Nakba has different iterations, different magnitudes, different things, and we need to periodize and historicize, definitely when it comes to Palestinian national formal politics. And these, I think, are extremely important changes. And in that sense, the Nakba, definitely after the failure of Oslo, is making it back to be an extremely important historical and epistemological political point of reference and mobilization for rethinking the whole entire question of Israel-Palestine. And I think our work fit into that kind of attempt, if you wish, this last attempt of rethinking.
Yeah.
First of all, you know, memory is part of identity. So as identity changes, memory changes, vice versa. It's not a clean, the difference between, there's also connections between history and memory, but also different. So memory changes over time and identity changes over time. And this is something that all scholars of memory assume, or that this is the baseline for study of memory. Now, I wouldn't say that the Holocaust wasn't central to Israeli and Jewish consciousness before, or identity before, before the 70s, 80s, and 90s. It was very central. You see it you see it everywhere. Also, already before. Let's talk about not the Jewish world, but in Israel. In Israel, you see it at least three paragraphs in the two paragraphs in the Declaration of Independence are talking about the Holocaust. The first laws, some of the first laws in the Israeli law book relate to the Holocaust. They accept confirm the Convention on Genocide, and then you have the 1950s, the early 1950s laws of Yad Vashem and the Day of Memorial Day, and so it's very central. And I mean, it's very central from the very beginning, but it changes. It changes over time, and I think the change, so it's central, and as many scholars already made it very clear, there was no silence. There was no silence. Also, the survivors spoke in different ways and in different venues, but they spoke. This Hasia Diner proved it in America, and Anna Yablonka, among others, proved it the same in but the way it is remembered, the structure of this memory has changed over time. And I think one way to articulate it is that perhaps the Holocaust was part of a story of Holocaust and redemption in the beginning of the years. That there was a Holocaust, and the state of Israel redeems this story. It was a kind of rebirth, and so that was the main narrative. That this narrative is still exists, but the dimension of the catastrophe and not and the sense of being victim has sharpened, and the centrality of the Holocaust has become. I mean, the Holocaust become much more central since the 80s and 90s. So it's not it's not the Holocaust we remember not as only in the paradigm of Holocaust and rebirth, Holocaust and redemption, but also Holocaust and victimhood. Holocaust is a form of Jewish victimhood, which becomes very, very central, that we all identify. We didn't redeem the Holocaust, but we are the Holocaust continues to this very day as a form of trauma, and we existential feel it. The centrality of it, the centrality of it in public life, in schools, in curriculum, everywhere. You can see it everywhere. And this also connects to our global cultural changes, that the Holocaust also became, in the West at least, very central. It was Americanized, it was globalized, or at least Westernized. And since the 80s, because of various changes, in the 90s, the end of the Cold War, and so various changes also in the Israeli identity and in global politics made the Holocaust very central in very different way, also for Jews in Israel and also for non-Jews in the Western world. And since then, the Holocaust is perhaps some say it replaced for the Western world the memory of the French Revolution as a kind of foundational past for Europe and America. And for Jews, it became, I would say, if in the beginning it was part of as I said, a bigger narrative of Holocaust and redemption, today it is the major component of Jews in Israel and all over the world. So those changes there are books and libraries on those changes that this memory underwent.
Okay, so we already have some interesting questions that were submitted in the chat box, and I want to encourage you and remind you to please submit your questions, and we will turn to them later in the discussion. Now, I still want to talk about the role of those events in the collective identities, collective memories of the two societies. But now, to look at it from another perspective, or to reverse the perspective, and to ask you perhaps to talk about the role of the Nakba in Jewish collective consciousness in Israel, and also the role of the Holocaust in the experience of Palestinians. So to look at the mirror reflection of the discussion that we had so far, how does the presence of the trauma of what is the presence of the Holocaust in the consciousness of Palestinians, and then the presence, what is the role of the Nakba in the collective consciousness of Israelis, and how this influences the collective experiences and also the relationship between those two groups. Who wants to start now? Amos, do you want to go ahead?
I think Bashir should go first.
Okay. Now, very briefly, I mean, in the sense of like, you know, there are a few things to say about this. In relation to the Holocaust featuring in the context of Palestinians talking about the Nakba or in the Nakba, I think the story is a little bit complicated, multi-layered, and it depends which context and which historical period. I think so. There is a wide spectrum of dominant view in the Palestinian intelligentsia post-Nakba time, through which the Holocaust and the Jewish question is being taken very seriously. And I'm talking about the intelligentsia, meaning that very early on you have Palestinian politicians and Palestinian intellectuals showing these sensitivities to the centrality of the Holocaust as something that is catastrophic, of a murderous, criminal kind of scale of European anti-Semitism and European Christian anti-Semitism. And that featured heavily in the Palestinians' insistence early on a post-Nakba time, definitely in the political programs of the Fatah and the Democratic Front and even the Popular Front in the 60s and the 70s, through which actually there was a very serious, engagement with the Jewish question and with the Holocaust. But there was a very bold distinction between Judaism and Zionism. This is first. And the second thing is between, the Holocaust as a catastrophe of murderous, scale of the Nazi beast of industry of death that under no circumstances there is any way but to describing in, the most disgraceful criminal acts and descriptions, and between the use and abuse of the Holocaust for purposes of political propaganda and political instrumental gains, which the governments of Israel, with the complicity of Europe and the West, including the US, have been deployed for the purpose of using that as a card through which basically the Palestinians are negated, the Palestinians are dismissed, and their tragedy and the tragedy when basically the victims of the victims, okay? Palestinians are the victims of the victims, and they are the victims of the anti-Semitic, genocidal tendencies of Europe in that sense. So this is why in my latter work in a different book that you mentioned, actually, I actually draw very intimate links between the Arab and the Jewish question, which is not the crux of our conversation, but this is one. Now, in order not to hijack the time, because I'm interested also to get at some point to the questions that are raised by the audience, is also that actually there is no. And this declined with some time for certain developments and with the 67 kind of war, and we are seeing some important flirt with those who are denying and also denying the Holocaust in certain kind of becoming with some presence in Arab kind of quarters, including in Palestinian quarters. But I think the Palestinian intelligentsia, mainstream intelligentsia, influential intelligentsia in the post-Nakba time has been consistent about basically honoring the Holocaust, its centrality, and seeing it as a European crime, but insisting on that the Palestinians should not pay the price. That is not to suggest, under no circumstances, obviously, that the Palestinians see this as, reject and insist to see this as something that at their expense. The last point that I want to make in this respect, that I think Palestinian nationalism and the realities have changed with the time. And I think this is one of the most important, probably added value that I would say that Amos and I do with some great deal of sensitivity, although it's explosive. And that is actually the Jewish existence, the Jewish Israeli colonial existence in Palestine also developed not only to be under the rubric of defined as only and exclusively as a settler colonial, which is definitely is, but it's also that it built a national Jewish Israeli identity of some sort. And in that sense, I think the Palestinian now, or those who are willing to deal with that type of question, deal with it also from this perspective of seeing and appreciating its centrality, but it's also trying to unpack its explosive and its instrumental use and abuse for the purpose of, eliminating, denying, negating the Palestinian suffering, but actually seeing it as a platform for disruptiveness through which you can see common ground for a joint actually dwelling and a joint conversation. And the ultimate proof of that is what we, Amos and I, do through our analysis of Ilyas Khouri's, the Lebanese Palestinian novelist, through his work in Bab al-Shams, but also his most recent novels, Awlad al-Gaytu, and the second edition of that is basically, if you wish, an extremely important exercise in literature and at the cultural register to push this conversation further through these types of intertwinement. But again, the history of, Gilbert Ashtar also has a very important book that actually featured the centrality of the Holocaust in the Arab intellectual life, which also has some very interesting insights about some denial and some instrumental use, etc., etc. But again, I mean, for me, now I have something to say about the Holocaust, the Nakba's presence in the Palestinian, in the Israeli context, and with the Holocaust. But maybe we give Amos first, and then, because I teach this, course at the Hebrew University, and some of my teaching at the Open University about, certain issues that relate to Zionism and relate to the crisis of Zionism at the moment. And I see, that the featuring of the Nakba, oddly enough, the more Israel is getting down the road in terms of its colonial domination, actually there is much more space for featuring actually what has been used to be perceived as something that is, you cannot talk about, or like it's a problematic thing. But I have something even more conceptually and related to the history of the Jews and how Zionism narrowed down the possibility of what it means to be a Jew through the use and the abuse and the position of the narrative over the Holocaust, and speaks on behalf of the Jewish people. And in that sense, I think that's a very unfortunate development through which Zionism actually reduced the possibility of what to be a Jew means in terms of actually having nationalism to be, or Jewish nationalism, Jewish Israeli nationalism, at least in its vulgar understanding, being the dominant form of Jew, and how that is linked to the Holocaust, the use and the abuse of it for navigating our way in Jewish life.
Amos, do you want to respond?
I think that, as Bashir said, as we just said it at the outset, the Holocaust is very, I mean, even if the Holocaust as central component of Jewish and Zionist identity is very difficult. Once it is loaded with this meaning, it's very difficult for Palestinians to engage with, because that sense as if they are giving in to the Zionist narrative that they don't want to be, as if they are giving up their rights. For Jews, as if talking about the Nakba means they are giving up their own identity. And so I think the Nakba is, to my understanding, is very present in Israeli consciousness, but through two tracks of memory. One, the major one, is negation. And you can see negation is also a kind of presenting. you can negate something only if once you negate it, you also present it. And I think there's a lot of negation. The 2011 law that actually authorizes Israel Ministry of Finance to cut budgets for all those institutions who commemorate the Nakba, actually does two things. On the one hand, it prohibits this memory, but on the other hand, it really presents it and puts it in the public sphere. And everybody then talks what about the Nakba, whether the Nakba happened, it didn't happen, who is responsible for it, but all of a sudden it's in the public sphere. And there is I think a stream of intellectuals and not only intellectuals that that remember it and take and consciously come to terms with it, not in terms of negation, but in terms of engagement. As I said, Avot Yeshurun is one of the biggest poets in Hebrew in modern times, came to it time and again in various ways. You can see it in Samech Izhar, see it in everyday language, you can see it in books that were written, even in Yiddish books that were written. So it's not only total negation and repression, but also through engagement and presentation. But what I feel, and this is, I think, if there is any kind of emancipatory and liberating aspect of our project, is say enough with the repression of those two memories in the two. Why not talk about them as they really happened and the connections between them? And then we draw our consequences. We think how we understand what are the consequences and what are the premises that for this joint story. But let's first of all negate the negation and put forward and confront what happened and the interconnections of those two, this complex components of the story. So I think the Nakba is very much present in Israel consciousness, either by negation, mostly by negation, but also because you have to, it's like in America, the wrongdoings of America. It took time for America to come to terms with it, and it still is coming to terms with it. The indigenous peoples and the African American and other non-white populations. It takes time but before you come to terms with it, you first put a lot of energy to negate it, and we're still mostly in this process of negation, because instead of I think this is my take on it.
Bashir, you wanted to add something to this question, to this particular topic?
No, I just said again. I mean, the issue of that there is a spectrum of things, like from negation to engagement to confrontation to kind of it depends where the historical period where it is, but no, I mean, I will stop here and we'll move to a different thing.
Okay, so now let's turn to some questions that we received from the audience. First of all, there is a historical question about 1948 that I think should be clarified. The question is from an anonymous attendee. To what degree can the Nakba be blamed on Arab leadership in 1948, and how does this change the nature of the conversation surrounding the Nakba?
So, I will let Bashir go first on that. I also want to say something.
I mean, again, this is a very typical kind of, articulation of some, very unserious way of trying to handle the question of 48. I mean, 48 and the Nakba would have happened regardless. And the issue of the Arab regimes and Arab armies, that's absolutely nonsensical because there were no Arab armies. There were certain groups of troops that were coming. So it's not really Arab armies in that sense. There is no doubt, obviously, that the question of 48 has very serious complications, including some Arab dimensions to it. But again, I mean, the primary responsible for the Palestinian Nakba and the ethnic cleansing of Palestine is the Jewish, and is the Zionist movement and its different arms and things. So, you know, I mean, I'm not in kind of, I understand where this comes from, but under no circumstances, I think this is like, you know, any serious historical account will show you that basically the Nakba would have happened, you know, regardless that type of role. But that is not to suggest that, you know, that the Arab dimension will expansively defined, not only through Arab regimes and Arab armies, expansively defined, is something that needs to be ignored or underestimated or that. But there is a difference between saying that you want to take that seriously and between making that, you know, the primary responsible for that is to be labeled on the shoulders of the Arab regimes and the Arab armies and all of that stuff. So I think, you know, it would be very, you know, very problematic and distorted historical account and ideological understanding of the very particular specificities of that and the dynamics of the global order in that particular history with the British mandate and all of that stuff to narrow down the understanding to be, you know, and assuming that there is a role, and there is a role, nobody denies. The question, what does that really make a difference? I don't think it makes a huge difference in that respect anyway, so.
Yeah, you know, it's not a history course right now, but it's already established by mainstream historiography. It's like since Palestinians always and the Arabs always claimed this, but since the late 80s, Benny Morris biographic extensive work, and then afterwards other historians that followed, and that this this is a myth. This is what I was told when I was, but this is a myth. The truth is that Nakba and the expulsion, or then some of the Palestinians were expelled, some of them flew, and some of them went and wanted to come back. Everybody wanted to come back, but then Israel prohibited that. And the proofs are that, I mean, the volumes that it was not because of the leadership, because the Zionists wanted, like after the Second World War, many other East European countries, for example, they wanted the whole war, the whole fight was about demography, about majority. And that was, and it started, you can see it, there's just reading in our book by the great historian Mark Mazover on how those tendencies of ethnic cleansing emigrated from Europe to Palestine, and the Jews in Eretz Israel, Zionists, wanted to reach a majority, and that's the main issue, and this is why it happened. And there's no leadership. Why was lead expelled? Why there was no leadership? Why Ben-Gurion said to Rabin, give his affirmation to expel thousands of people from Lod and from Haifa, and so it's. I mean, it's about it's a slogan. It's a myth that was already proven as wrong by all major historians. And actually, you know, you see Zionists talk about transfer very early. Yosef Weitz, and there was a transfer committee. There was a Plan D. Exactly what is the meaning of all those Plan D that to expel, regardless of, to expel Palestinians since I think March 1948, and perhaps I'm wrong in the date. So the ideas of expulsion, that you have transfer, the ideas, and they came from you. They came from 1923 in between Turkey and Greece, and they came to the after the war, and the ideas of reaching a majority are very dominant in Zionist thinking, and especially since the 30s and 40s. And that was the major. I mean, it was already established. I mean, this is. I mean, it's just saying. I don't know, like saying anything else is not serious historiography to my. Now, another thing that we have to remember, and this already Jabotinsky acknowledged in his Iron Wall, very famous piece in Iron Wall, 1923, that he, first of all, he said it's a colonial setting. This is one thing he said. And he said, but we have the right. He was a Zionist. It was a colonial setting. And he understands, he foresees that the war is going to be very long because he says, no indigenous people gives up its land. We have no Jabotinsky, the great revisionist Zionist leader. No, they are going to fight, and we have to acknowledge it. We have to confront it. The Palestinians are going to fight. And this is what happened. They didn't want to give up their land, and there was a fight. And because, and it's very complex, but basically, there is responsibility, all sort of responsibility also on the Palestinian, but the act, who actually expelled or prohibited them, the refugees to come back, despite the UN resolution 194, that called those are the Israelis. So I think I know I grew up on this slogan, but it has no historiographical credibility anymore. That was the really big revolution of the late 1980s and in Zionist historiography.
Just one comment of clarification. You mentioned Jabotinsky, and you're referring to Ze'ev Jabotinsky. Vladimir Ze'ev Jabotinsky was the leader of right-wing revisionist Zionism in the pre-state period in Palestine.
I would add that at certain points, very liberal right-wing. Certain points less liberal, but at certain points, very liberal.
So we have more questions about the history of 1948 and about other historical issues, but we also have a question, I think from Tamar, about the project itself that I think will be very interesting to hear your thoughts or your reaction to this question. If there are any issues that you disagreed about, and if so, how that affected the project?
You want to say something about that, Bashir?
I mean, I more than anything else, I think this has been a very long process. We did have obviously some, I wouldn't say radical disagreements, otherwise this project would have not taken off in the first place. But before Amos and I start writing anyway, the history of the project, that Amos invited me for a talk to high school teachers to speak about the Holocaust, and then the story began, and I said that I have certain conditions, etc., that I will speak about the Holocaust and the Nakba and all of that stuff. And then the conversation went on. Amos and I think to a large extent had some disagreements, serious agreements. I think sometimes there were some issues related to our disciplinary interest, which if there were, a misunderstanding, it was a very profound learning process. And I have to say that certain things that I have learned a great deal from Amos through his familiarity with the Holocaust studies, with cultural dimensions of trauma and memory and all of that stuff. So, there was a very serious conversation between and Amos, I would say, more about sensitivities and the explosive materials that we use and we navigate through than our own private disagreements. I think our private political disagreements and conceptual disagreements were very minor, and they were very enriching when there was misunderstanding or disagreements, through which actually it turned out to be powerfully enriching what the challenge was, less on that, the challenge was, and Tamar is right, these are explosive, sensitive issues. And now we speak about it in a much easier way. This book has been selling hundreds of copies. It's being reprinted for the fifth time, or I guess, or the fourth time. The book was sold out entirely in 3 weeks and a half from the day of its publication, the first edition. So, Amos and I had a long history, and this history is continuing until today. Back in the time, and continue until today, but back in the time, we were much more fearful and sensitive to this raw material, kind of not raw, but actually the initial idea and the original idea, and we continue to, until today, to be faced by colleagues, definitely Israeli Jewish colleagues, that saying definitely more to Amos than to me probably, but, that they are having, this kind of uncomfortable positions about putting us even the title, and people say, if you would drop the title. No, but I mean, the whole thing is about the title. So why to drop the title? And people were sensitive, about even, without even reading a page in it, So we were inviting people for these types of conversation. Luckily enough, I think we seem to be having, struck certain, kind balance through which where we do address these very bare bones and nerves sensitively, where our aim is to push the conversation forward, where our aim is really to honor the memories of these tragic memories and that continue to inform our daily existence and all that stuff. But the disagreement, or the challenge, I would say, not disagreements, that manifested sometimes itself in certain disagreements, were about the magnitude, the terms, the type of emphasis we place, and the sequence sometimes of things. But I think with the time and through very open conversation with the help of some colleagues, we did manage. We did have to compromise between ourselves, but more importantly, sometimes we did have to compromise with publishers, not the books, but articles. I don't know, but maybe Amos can tell this story about the 5 referees that read our article. And Amos actually said that he wanted to withdraw that article from wherever we sent it. And I was the one who insisted, no, we shouldn't withdraw that, because Amos felt that these reviewers were much stronger of gatekeepers of the centrality of the Holocaust, because, this is kind of, breaking a taboo. We are very proud that we broke that taboo. And I think this is the pioneering dimensions of our work. But I think Amos and I have broken this taboo with dignity, with sensitivity, and with some great deal of paying respect and honor these memories without compromising our sense of integrity, our respective views about that they converge to a large extent about how we think the future of this land needs to be, but also the present and the past of this land. So, I mean, that's a very long answer to a very brief one, where I would say we didn't have huge disagreements. Most of our disagreements stemmed from our disciplinary kind of different backgrounds, but we did manage to, enrich each other on that respect. But the disagreements went sometimes about, because we weren't, we knew that we are doing with explosive thing, and the Van Leer event for the book that Ori mentioned, there was a demonstration against the book outside from Inter 2, and they had to hire a security company to search everyone coming in. But luckily enough, more than 300 people showed up for the launch of the book in Hebrew. And the book was in the news for a week in Raw. And we had a huge covering story in Haaretz, and maybe soon in Germany in the Frankfurter. We don't know. I mean, the reception of the book is way much more interesting than we, and much more, sensitive than we had thought. And we are very happy about that. But again, I mean, it doesn't mean that there aren't things that we would have changed or we revised if we would have been in a position to look at things differently now.
I would like to say also, first of all, for me, it's a transformative project. I mean, I've written books, I've written articles, I edited before books on any vote. This was a transformative because, as Bashir said, we come from different perspectives, different groups, of course, but different disciplines. And this whole idea of binationalism was new to me. In a period of my life that I was searching for new ways to think about the conflict because of, look, I was raised in a religious Zionist household, and when I was searching for those new avenues to think about, I learned quite a lot from Bashir, and sometimes I was, taken back by some of what he said, and but now so and he knows very well after once. Those are not disagreements. I mean, with disagreements, we managed by articulating, and I will give an example of some place very minor where a disagreement came up and we had to come to terms. But most of the disagreements we could articulate and re-articulate. But basically, the basic contours of this project, that the Holocaust is a very major event in world history and has to become, the Arabs have to come to terms with it, and Palestinians have to come to terms with it as part of their history. And the Nakba is essential for Jewish and Israeli understanding. Those are the basic components we agree. And as time elapsed, as time also on the binational aspect of this and all its implication in terms of writing a binational history, not a national history, but a binational history, just from my point of view. But I want to give two examples. First of all, when the book came out, the book in Hebrew, it sat on my desk for 3 months. I didn't dare open it because I really thought that I would say, I was self-experienced some kind of perhaps breaking a taboo that I was not ready, or perhaps psychologically to acknowledge. I was perfectly. So this is where, I mean, I don't know. I know Bashir experienced it differently. He has to come to terms with problems in his community, and I had to come to terms with what people, including my father. But I will give an example where we had those small places where the sensitivities are different, and we had to come to terms with it. Like, for example, I wrote a sentence. We had to stress over and over again that we don't mean that the Holocaust and the Nakba are very different. And we stress it, we stress it. It's very important for us, not only for political, to make it clear that we're not trying to say those are, for various reasons, but also from a Jewish perspective, it's very important not to conflate them. And I suggested writing after all, there was no Treblinka and Auschwitz in Palestine. Now, this is, as a matter of fact, this is true. There was no Auschwitz but as all linguistics know, it's not only what you say, it's what you act in your. And when you say that, you downplay the Palestinian catastrophe. And that was, and through this engagement between us, I understood that we have to put it in some other, to articulate it differently, in a way that will respect the Palestinian catastrophe and the Nakba and its consequences and the ongoing, not to downplay it because there was no Treblinka, and at the same time, finding the way to articulate that those are two different events. So, and we had many such kinds of engagements. Sometimes Bashir accepted my sensitivities, and sometimes his sensitivities. Sometimes I have to come to terms to find some middle way in order to get it right, but also in the right way to articulate it.
Thank you for both of you for those very, very thoughtful answers to this question. I want to take one more another comment or question here, which actually brings us back to the historical issues, but it's connected to your remarks, Amos, about Treblinka and Auschwitz not present in Palestine. So it's a comment from Yossi Galron, who writes that the big transfer happened after the Second World War with the expulsion of Germans, of ethnic Germans from Central Europe, from Czechoslovakia and Poland. And this is an important comment, I think, because I think also some of the people who have written on your book also mentioned that the maybe the more appropriate comparison would be between the Nakba and this ethnic cleansing in Eastern Central Europe, because we're talking about two cases of ethnic cleansing rather than ethnic cleansing and genocide. So maybe we could go back to those historical questions, and you could relate to that comment.
Certainly, I certainly agree, and it's not only the Germans that were expelled from Poland and Czechoslovakia and Hungary, and after World War, put it very bluntly, if after World War I, the international solution was minority rights and it failed, after World War II, the solution was expulsions. Expulsions of, let's take Poland for example. The Ukrainians, Poland was between the two world wars, more than 30% were minorities, and it was a great problem for the Polish nationalists. And since the Second World War, it's one of the most homogeneous nation states in Europe. How did that happen? Because they, as they said, they expelled the Jews. The Jews were killed, they were murdered by the Nazis. Those who came back were actually driven out by the Poles. Most of them, not all of them. The Germans were kicked out by the Poles, and the Ukrainians, they had some territorial transfers and territorial exchange and a lot of also expulsions. So there are no Ukrainians who were the biggest, biggest minority between the two world wars. So there was expulsions all over. But what we claim is, and I think it is already, it's not only us, and I mentioned Mazover, but we can talk about many others like Bloxham, like Moses, like there are differences, but there's also a continuity between expulsions and ethnic cleansing and genocide. You can see it, for example, in Yugoslavia, in former Yugoslavia, which was Srebrenica was defined as genocide, but it actually took place within mass ethnic cleansing. And you can see it in the Nazis, in the history of Nazi Germany, because the first they want to expel the Jews, and not only the Jews. The first thing that they did in 1939 and 1940 was to expel hundreds of thousands of Poles and Jews from the western parts, and that evolved into a genocide. So so of course there are differences, but the line is not you cannot set in stone the line, the border, the limit between those two phenomena. And actually they are in a continuum, and they both share, as Hannah Arendt already was to acknowledge it in 1951 in her book, that there's some continuity because the basic impulse of homogeneity is shared by both phenomena. And you can see in many cases that they start as expulsions and ethnic cleansing, and they evolve into genocide. So you can see it all over Europe, you can see it outside of Europe, and you can see, because those are two methods very different in the consequence of demographic engineering. And so, of course, and what we say in our book, that the Holocaust, as radical as it is, and the Nakba are both as different as they are. They also both share some historical features and conceptual features with many, very, very many others, histories of expulsion and genocide, or ethnic cleansing and genocide. So, okay, this is, in a nutshell, and I can give you just a quick example. If someone wants to read Mazover and Mazover's Mark Mazover, for example, No Enchanted Place, The End of Empire and the Ideological Origins of the United Nations, for example. He has a whole chapter about the connections between those two, and you can read it more, Donald Block, Mark Levine, who wrote Mark Levine, who is a historian of Holocaust and genocides and ethnic cleansing, perhaps one of the most prominent, and wrote a chapter, connects them because conceptually and historically they are connected, though, as I say, very, very different.
Thank you, Amos. Bashir, you want to respond to this?
Yeah, very briefly, but I think I just want to add to that actually this kind of transfer from or shift from imperial order to the national order with its all of kind of sinful genocidal ethnic cleansing tendencies of seeking homogeneity and purity has also a very important arm, and that kind of colonialism that seems to be at work as well, which we also pay attention to in our work. And this is very interesting in the context of Zionism. Because I mean, at the end of the day, Zionism is a European phenomenon, came to answer a European question rather than it's a Mediterranean issue, came to answer a Mediterranean Arab-Muslim question. It didn't. This is a European phenomenon answering a European question, coming to address actually the failure of European Christian nationalism to accommodate the Jews and give an answer to them. But intimately to that, what is really interesting and very problematic equally is basically that our book is also some form of interrogating Zionism, because Zionism in the mainstream of it and in the over majority of its strand is very actually siding with this Herderian, East European, Central European kind of notion of nationalism, of ethno-nationalism, through which you actually have this homogeneity. Sorry, you have not only homogeneity, but ethnic superiority of some sort. And that sense, Zionism, the way it actualizes itself in Palestine through that kind of vulgar ethno-nationalism is very clear of what Hannah Arendt said, what is going to really produce in terms of realities in Palestine, in terms of connecting also Zionism, to this kind of ethno-nationalism and drive for homogeneity, but also for that kind of settler colonial dimension that is actually extremely important and fundamental to understand the way Zionism has developed in Palestine and the way the Nakba was almost structurally built into any serious attempt of materializing that kind of ethno-nationalism under the language and the rubric of Jewish majority, Jewish nation state. Jewish majority where? Jewish nation state where? On the flesh of the Palestinians, because Palestine was populated, Palestinian existed, and the identity was there, and Palestinian identity would have developed regardless Zionism, because Palestinian identity was going to be the product of the collapse of the imperial order into the national order. Palestinian nationalism will most likely develop differently than its meeting with Zionism. That's for sure, probably. But the Palestinian nationalism, as part and parcel of Arab nationalism, would have developed regardless the existence of Zionism, precisely because of this shift. But the settler colonial nature of that, through what is this Judaizing the space? Until today, Israeli politicians say, we want to Judaize the Negev. We want to Judaize Liyahedet Galil, Liyahedet Negev. What does that mean? I mean, again, so this kind of drive for homogeneity, for majority, is some of these arsenals and techniques of settler colonial kind of eliminatory politics that Israel is very armed. And our project, and by this I finish, does not remain at the level of diagnosis, meaning that Amos and I does not only establish and demonstrate the connection, but Amos and I go the extra step by saying what productively and instructively this convergence produces. And what we say is that it produces egalitarian binationalism. And I think it's about time that we have to face the fact that equality is not a vice to fight, but a value to endorse. And equality is not a shameful value, but something to endorse and embrace. And there is nothing that goes against that. We look at the Arabs and the Jews as equal parties, where this needs to be looked within the rubric of egalitarian binationalism and coming to terms with the Palestinian Nakba and its own consequences. To depict the demand for equality as a crime, or as an evil to fight, or as an exception of Jewish supremacy, or as an anti-Semitic label against those who are advocating equality, is a shameful, disgraceful form of engagement of any type of those who want to engage with the future of this land. Arab-Jewish partnership is something to endorse and value. Equality between the Arabs and the Jews, the Israeli Jews in Palestine under circumstances of decolonization and historical reconciliation and coming to terms with Palestinian Nakba, chiefly the right of return, is something to endorse and a platform to work with rather than something to negate and something to criminalize and something to police and silence through deploying different definitions of anti-Semitism and different types of things in order to do this. This is where this project is kind of, saying boldly these types of things, by extension, obviously.
So this leaves certainly a lot of food for thought. We're now out of time. So unfortunately, we cannot take more questions, but I think our speakers did a very good job in engaging a lot of questions from the audience. So let me thank our speakers for sharing with us their work, their thoughts about their work. I also want to thank again the Mann family for supporting the program. I want to thank the Milton Center for facilitating the program. And thank you, all of you, for joining us today. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye. Thank you.